What happens when a powerful CEO tries to fire a janitor, but ends up facing a 6-year-old girl whose words pierce deeper than any boardroom betrayal? Graham Mercer had it all: wealth, reputation, control. He built his empire on order, efficiency, and never letting emotions interfere with business. But one phone call was about to turn his perfectly curated life upside down. He thought he was dismissing a cleaner. He never expected to meet Willow, a bright-eyed girl who simply said, "Please, don't take my mom away. She's all I have." That moment didn't just stop him, it unraveled him. Behind that child's voice was a story of pain, strength, and quiet resilience. And behind the woman he nearly fired was a past he'd long buried, one that forced him to choose between staying safe in success or stepping into the messiness of love, justice, and humanity. What unfolds is a journey of transformation, healing, and a confrontation with everything Graham thought he knew about family, power, and purpose. So, what would you do if a child reminded you of the part of yourself you thought you lost? If you're ready for a story that moves your heart and challenges your views, hit like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. Graham Mercer believed every hour of his day had a purpose. He didn't just run a company. He orchestrated an empire. Mercer Logistics powered supply chains across the nation: airports, trucking fleets, warehouses. It was cold, efficient, and necessary, much like the man behind it. At 6:00 a.m., Graham's alarm chimed. Not buzzed, chimed. He didn't like loud noises waking him. His bed was made within 5 minutes. His coffee brewed precisely 2 minutes and 20 seconds. 1 sugar cube, never 2. He ran 3 miles on his private treadmill and listened to economic forecasts from Bloomberg on 1.5x speed. By 7:30, he was standing alone in the elevator that ascended to the top floor of the Mercer Building in downtown Chicago. 51 stories of glass and steel. Every inch of that tower echoed with his name and his expectations. His office, quiet, cold, immaculate, faced the skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind a mahogany desk that had once belonged to a U.S. senator. No clutter, no paper clips, no personal photos, just quarterly reports, schedules, and power. He liked silence. Silence was efficient. Conversations, unless necessary, were inefficient. By 8:05, his assistant, Julia Kim, arrived with a folder of reports and a fresh legal pad, as she did every weekday. She placed them down and started to leave, but paused. Just for a moment. That pause broke his rhythm. Graham glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, voice even. Julia hesitated, fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this to your attention, sir. It's a minor HR issue. Small, really." Graham folded his hands. "Then you should have resolved it." "I would have," she said quickly. "It's just the cleaning staff assigned to this floor, Ms. Hartley. She hasn't shown up yesterday or today. No call, no message." He blinked once, slowly. 2 days. "Is she freelance or on contract?" Julia answered. "But she's been regular, punctual, never late until now." Graham tapped his pen once. He did not know what Lena Hartley looked like. He rarely met contractors. They existed in a space outside the executive lens, noticed only when something went wrong. "No show without notice violates the agreement," he said calmly. "Draft her termination papers." "Yes, sir," Julia said, but didn't move. Graham raised an eyebrow. "She's never missed a day, sir, in 3 years. And I just had a strange feeling. It might be nothing, but it didn't feel like she just quit." Graham sighed softly. Disruptions to his system irritated him. Yet something about Julia's hesitation lingered. "Do we have a contact number for her?" Julia blinked, then nodded and retrieved a small slip of paper from her tablet case. "Here." He took it without ceremony. He did not like handling things that others were supposed to manage. But sometimes, control meant eliminating ambiguity at the source. He glanced once at the digits, picked up the phone, and dialed. He was already rehearsing what to say. A brief, clear message. Professional, not unkind. Direct, not emotional. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then a small voice answered. Hello, Graham's spine straightened. The voice wasn't adult. It wasn't even close. It was small. A little girl's whisper, barely audible. He didn't speak right away. It felt wrong to... "Hello," he finally said. "Is this the Hartley residence?" "Yes," the voice replied, just above a breath. "May I speak to Lena Hartley?" A pause, then the voice came again. "Mommy can't talk right now. She's really sick." Graham froze. He was good at reading between words negotiation, press, diplomacy, but this was different. "I see," he said slowly. "Who am I speaking to?" "Willow," she whispered. He had to close his eyes for a moment. "How old are you?" "Willow 6. Another long pause. Then, almost like a rehearsed line, Willow said softly, "If you need someone to clean, I can come. We need the money." Graham couldn't find breath. For a man who commanded thousands, who'd closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, he suddenly had no response. "We need the money." That was all she'd said. Not a complaint, not a plea, just fact. A fact delivered in the gentlest, smallest voice he had ever heard. He pressed a hand to his temple. "Willow, thank you. But no, you don't have to do that. I hope your mom feels better soon." "Okay," she said, almost silently. Then the line went dead. She had hung up. Graham sat there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. The office around him was silent as always, but for the first time in years, that silence wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Julia re-entered quietly. Should I move forward with the termination? Graham didn't respond at first. "No," he said finally, "not yet." She nodded, surprised, and left. Graham leaned back in his chair and stared out the window. 51 floors up. The city looked so small, manageable. But not that voice, not that girl. He couldn't manage that. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to. That night, long after the office emptied and the sun slipped behind the skyline, Graham remained seated, the slip of paper still in his hand. He wasn't thinking about productivity. He was thinking about a 6-year-old girl offering to scrub floors, and the terrifying truth that, for once, he didn't know what to do. The next morning, Graham Mercer arrived at the office earlier than usual. He didn't sleep much the night before. Instead, he sat in his living room long after midnight, the lights dimmed, a half-drunk glass of water beside him. He had replayed the conversation with Willow Hartley again and again. Her voice was now etched in his mind, the kind of memory you didn't ask for, but couldn't turn away from. We need the money, not a demand, not even desperation, just clarity, just truth. He tried to bury it under routine. He went for his morning run, prepared his coffee, reviewed the quarterly figures for the Chicago distribution hub, but even numbers, His oldest comfort offered no peace. He couldn't forget the way her voice trembled at the end, or the way she offered to replace her mother like it was something ordinary, something expected of a 6-year-old. Julia Kim entered his office at 7:45 carrying a report on procurement delays. She paused, noticing his faraway stare. "Sir." Graham blinked and looked up. "Yes." She hesitated. "Should I go ahead with rescheduling the HR termination meeting for Ms. Hartley?" He stared at her for a moment, then pushed the papers aside. "No," he said. "I need her address." Julia blinked. "Her address. I want to check in. Personally." Julia's eyes widened slightly. In all her 3 years of working under Graham Mercer, she had never once seen him visit an employee, let alone a contract cleaner. But she nodded slowly and tapped into her tablet. "I'll send it to your car system." "Don't. I'll drive myself." Julia almost dropped the stylus in her hand. Graham stood and reached for his coat. "Hold my calls until I say otherwise. Reschedule the finance review and the lunch with Colton Reeves." "Yes, sir," Julia said, watching him like he was someone else. He didn't explain himself. He never did. But as he walked through the corridor of glass offices, he felt each footstep heavier than the last. His employees greeted him with polite nods. He didn't return them. He got into his own car for the first time in months and keyed in the directions to the address Julia had provided. The building was only 25 minutes away from downtown, but as he drove into the older neighborhood on the south side, it felt like another city altogether. The streets narrowed, paint peeled from the buildings, rusted fences bent under their own weight. A few kids kicked a ball near a corner store, their laughter bright and out of place among the broken sidewalks. He found the apartment building. Brick, 3 stories. The entry buzzer was broken. He tried the door. It opened with a heavy groan. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old floor wax and mildew. Dim lights flickered overhead. He scanned for unit numbers, climbing the narrow stairs until he found 3B. The numbers were handwritten on a taped index card. For the first time in a very long time, Graham hesitated before knocking. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, then knocked gently. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. But just as he was about to turn away, he heard the faint click of a lock. The door opened 3 inches, and there she was, Willow Hartley, tiny, pale, her curly hair half brushed and caught back with a pink butterfly clip. She wore a faded gray t-shirt and socks with no shoes. Her eyes, wide and blue, stared up at him like he might vanish if she blinked. "Hi," she said softly. Graham couldn't speak at first. It was one thing to hear a child's voice over the phone, another to see the child behind it. "Hi, Willow," he said, carefully. "Is your mom home?" Willow nodded once, then opened the door wider. He stepped inside. The apartment was small but clean, tidy. A folded blanket on the sofa. A dish towel hung to dry over the oven handle. A few drawings were taped to the wall, a sun, a stick-figure girl, a house with a crooked heart above it. He followed Willow's silent lead to the back room, where a twin bed sat against the wall. A woman lay there, propped up with 2 pillows. Her face was pale, eyes shadowed with fatigue. She blinked slowly, trying to sit up. "Mr. Mercer," she rasped, voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I didn't call. I didn't want to." He raised a hand gently. "It's okay. You're ill. That's all I need to know. I thought I could sleep it off. Just a day. But then I couldn't stand yesterday. And I didn't want to make a fuss. I didn't want to cause problem. You didn't, he said, though the truth was her absence had disrupted more than his schedule. She looked at Willow, who stood by the wall, hands clasped nervously. Did she answer the phone? She did, he said, voice soft. She said something to me that I can't forget. Lena Hartley. He finally connected her face to the name, closed her eyes briefly. I told her not to touch the phone, but I guess she was worried. She was brave. Graham replied, and honest. There was a long silence. I didn't mean to miss work, Naomi whispered. I've never missed a day, but I couldn't get out of bed. Graham glanced around the room. It was sparse. A single photo on the nightstand, a cup of tea gone cold, the faint hum of a heater struggling to keep up. You don't need to apologize, he said. Naomi looked up. That's kind of you, but we both know how the world works. Graham folded his arms. The world may work like that, but maybe it shouldn't. He looked over at Willow, who was still standing quietly, eyes flicking between them. You offered to clean for your mom, he said gently. Willow nodded, almost imperceptibly. That was very grown up of you, he said, but not your job. Willow shifted on her feet. We need the money. The room fell into a hush. Graham closed his eyes for a moment. The sentence hit him just as hard as the first time. I'm not here to fire your mom, he said slowly. I'm here to make sure you both have what you need. Naomi's eyes welled. She looked away. I've never taken charity. This isn't charity, Graham said. It's accountability. Mine. Naomi frowned. What do you mean I built something that runs on silence? He said, people like you clean the corners of it. And I never noticed. Until now. She didn't respond. Willow looked up at him. Do you still need someone to clean? He knelt down, meeting her eyes. I think I need someone to remind me what matters. Willow didn't smile, but something in her relaxed. Naomi wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her shirt. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Graham replied. Just get better. Willow reached for her mother's hand and held it tightly. Graham watched them for a moment, then stood and looked around again. This time, not as a CEO, but as a man seeing things he had never allowed himself to see before. He stayed for a few more minutes, then left the apartment quietly, his heart heavier but somehow softer. Outside, the wind had picked up, sweeping through the narrow streets. He pulled his coat tighter, but for the first time in a long time, the cold didn't bother him. Graham Mercer didn't return to the office after leaving Lena Hartley's apartment. He drove without direction, letting the city unfold in front of him like a slow confession. The car hummed along Lakeshore Drive, past the sparkling water of Lake Michigan. The sky above was clear, the sunlight bouncing off the towers in golden shards, but inside the car, everything felt muted. He parked outside his penthouse and sat still in the driver's seat for several minutes. His hands were on the wheel, but his mind was back in a tiny, dimly lit apartment on the south side. He couldn't stop picturing Willow's face, the way she stood near the wall, silent and observant, the way her fingers curled nervously around each other, the way she offered help like it was the most natural thing a child could do. She hadn't cried, not once. Graham had negotiated mergers, bought out failing companies, and won lawsuits without flinching. But this stayed with him in a way he didn't understand yet. In his apartment, everything was as he'd left it. Floors gleamed, Counters sparkled. A single orchid sat blooming on the windowsill, its petals perfect, too perfect. He poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the people below. Somewhere out there, Lena and Willow were probably having soup or toast, something simple. Maybe Willow was drawing again. Maybe she was asking her mother when she'd be able to go back to work. He imagined Lena answering carefully, not wanting to worry her daughter. He imagined how many times she'd probably done that, smiled through pain, stood while dizzy, worked when her body needed rest. And he had almost fired her. Without question, without hesitation, that realization hit him in the chest like a quiet thunder. He thought about the world he'd built. He had always been proud of it, how clean, efficient, impenetrable it was. A company of systems and protocols. No mess, no excuses, no exceptions. But now that structure, the very one he'd worshipped for decades, suddenly looked like glass, cold, clear, brittle. Later that evening, he called Marianne Ford, his longtime corporate attorney. She was sharp, logical, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Marianne," he said, trying to sound composed. "Graham," she greeted, her tone clipped. "Everything all right? I need you to review the contractual protections we offer to cleaning staff on service contracts. And I want to know what options we have for short-term paid medical leave, even outside standard agreements." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Marianne said, "You're referring to the Hartley situation." He hesitated. "Yes, I thought that was a termination case." "It's not." "Understood." She paused. "Do you want this formalized through HR?" "No," he said. "Not yet. I want to handle it personally." Marianne was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. "I assume there's a reason for that." Graham looked at the floor, at the polished hardwood that reflected the evening light. He thought of Willow's tiny voice again. "There's a little girl," he said, and she answered the phone for her mother. Marianne didn't speak. She didn't need to. Graham ended the call and stood at the window again. The skyline looked different now, still sharp, still towering, but distant, cold. He wondered when he had become so comfortable with that distance. The next morning, he returned to Lena's apartment. He didn't bring staff, no assistants, no PR spin, just himself and a paper bag of groceries he had picked out personally. Fruit, bread, a small bottle of honey, and a coloring book with crayons. He knocked softly. Willow opened the door, still wearing the same faded shirt. Her hair was neater today, tied into 2 short braids. "You came back," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. "I said I would," he replied. She opened the door fully and let him in. This time, she led him straight to the kitchen. Lena was sitting at the table. Her back was a little straighter, though her face was still pale. There were dark rings under her eyes, but they softened slightly when she saw him. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said quickly, her voice hoarse but stronger. "I know," Graham said, placing the bag on the table, "but I wanted to." Lena looked down, her hands resting in her lap. Her fingers twisted slightly, like she was trying to undo some invisible knot. "I don't want to be anyone's burden," she said. "You're not," he said gently. "This isn't about charity. It's about recognition." She glanced at him. "Recognition. For 3 years, you've worked silently to keep our offices clean. You showed up without complaint, without delay, and when you got sick, it took a 6-year-old to make me realize what we've built is missing something important." Lena blinked rapidly, trying not to let tears fall. "Thank you," she said finally. Graham pulled out the coloring book and handed it to Willow. Her eyes lit up, but she didn't run off. She stayed at her mother's side, like a little soldier still on duty. "You can color if you'd like," Graham offered. Willow looked up at her mom, seeking silent permission. Lena nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart." The girl slipped into a seat near the couch and opened to the first page, choosing a purple crayon with care. Graham watched her for a moment, then turned back to Lena. "Have you seen a doctor?" "No," she said quietly. "I can't afford one right now." "You can now," he said. "We'll arrange it." "I didn't ask." "You don't have to," he said, not unkindly. She swallowed hard. "You don't even know us. I'm learning." For a few seconds, they said nothing. The only sound in the room was the gentle scratch of crayon against paper. "Why are you really here?" she asked finally, voice low. "Men like you don't just show up in places like this." He took a deep breath. "Because for the first time in a long time, I'm seeing what I've ignored. And because I don't want to go back to that kind of blindness." Her eyes softened. But there was something else behind them, too. Fear, not of him, exactly, but of what it might mean to believe him. People didn't stay, not in her experience. "I don't want Willow to get attached," she whispered. "If this is temporary—" Graham's gaze followed the curve of Willow's tiny shoulders as she leaned over her drawing. "Neither do I," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Lena looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "You can't fix our life." "I'm not here to fix it," he said. "I'm just here." Willow looked up at that moment, holding up her page. "Look," she said proudly, "it's a sun with a heart inside." Graham walked over slowly and took the page in his hand. It was simple. Crayon lines, a circle with yellow rays and a red heart in the center. Nothing extraordinary. But it undid him. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. Willow smiled, just a little. That night, when Graham returned home, the silence didn't comfort him. It echoed, and for the first time, he wished it didn't. The boardroom smelled like leather and polished ambition. Graham Mercer sat at the head of the table, as he always did. 12 seats stretched out in each direction, filled by executives in crisp suits with expressions sharpened by profit margins and market trends. The room buzzed with polite tension, the kind that came when leaders pretended to listen but were really waiting to talk. PowerPoint slides flickered on the wall, each filled with charts, numbers, growth curves, forecasts, efficiencies, targets. Colton Reeves, the company's CFO, was deep into a presentation about streamlining regional operations. He spoke with confidence, nodding to phrases like leaner logistics, contract consolidations, and cost savings over a 5-year arc. Graham tried to focus. He really did. But his eyes drifted toward the corner of the room, where a janitor's closet stood closed and forgotten. He imagined someone like Lena Hartley quietly cleaning that room after hours, long after these suits had gone home. He pictured Willow trailing behind, a crayon drawing tucked under one arm, her socks worn at the heels. Graham adjusted his cufflink, trying to shake the image. Colton was still talking. "If we eliminate contract redundancies and shift to outsourced custodial providers with AI-based scheduling, we're projecting a 6.3% decrease in facility costs. That's over $8 million annually." Graham's jaw tensed. $8 million, he repeated under his breath. Colton glanced at him. Yes, and with scalable implementation across our warehouses, how many workers would that affect? Colton hesitated. Roughly 260, give or take. But most are part-time, non-essential. No pension burden, non-essential. The word echoed through Graham's chest like a knock on a hollow door. He sat back in his chair, one hand pressed to his chin, eyes narrowing. The room went quiet. What if, Graham said slowly, instead of eliminating these roles, we invest in them? Colton blinked. Sorry. What if we offer basic health support, paid sick days, emergency stipends, job security for the people who keep our buildings functioning while we sleep? A rustle moved through the room like wind through tall grass. Executives exchanged glances. With all due respect, Graham, Colton began, those workers aren't core to our operational output. This company thrives on efficiency, and right now our system is bloated. Graham leaned forward. Numbers aren't the only measure of value. Colton tilted his head. Measuring. That's a sentiment, not a strategy. Graham's eyes hardened. It's reality. Julia Kim, seated silently near the back, scribbled something on her notepad but didn't speak. She glanced up once, just enough to catch Graham's expression. He wasn't angry. He was clear. And that, in her experience, was far more dangerous. I want a revised plan, Graham said. Include a model where contract staff get access to basic benefits. I want it by end of week. Colton's jaw flexed. That would undercut our Q4 targets. Then the targets are wrong. Graham stood. Meeting over, he walked out without another word. Back in his office, he didn't sit right away. He stood by the window, staring out at the city that once felt like his playground and now felt like a stranger's map. He pressed a hand to the glass, his reflection staring back at him. For years, he had built his success on the idea that people were assets. Replaceable, predictable, measurable. He never asked how many lives his cost-saving strategies had upended, never questioned what his silence allowed others to endure, until a little girl with a quiet voice broke that silence in half. Later that day, he returned home early, not to work, not to strategize, to remember. He opened a box he hadn't touched in over a decade. Tucked behind old legal binders in the back of his closet, it smelled faintly of dust and memories. Inside was a single photograph. A boy with messy dark hair, no older than 7, crouched beside an old Ford pickup. Beside him, a woman with tired eyes and calloused hands smiled at the camera. Her arm wrapped tightly around the boy's shoulder. His mother. Her name was Eloise Mercer. She had worked double shifts as a laundromat clerk and cleaned offices on weekends. She died before Graham's 22nd birthday. A stroke they couldn't afford to treat fast enough. He swallowed the sudden tightness in his throat. She had never missed a day of work. He remembered once, when he was 8, she had a fever so high she could barely stand. Still, she dressed, packed a sandwich for Graham, and told him not to answer the phone unless it was an emergency. He remembered feeling helpless, small, much like Willow. He closed the box and sat on the floor, the photo still in his hands. Maybe this wasn't about Lena Hartley. Maybe this wasn't about charity or guilt. Maybe it was about a boy who never got to say thank you, and a man who didn't want another child growing up believing no one would come when it mattered. The next day, Graham visited the Hartleys again. He didn't warn them. He just showed up. Willow opened the door with a coloring pencil tucked behind her ear. She smiled slightly. You came back again." He nodded. "Is your mom awake?" "She's in the kitchen." The apartment smelled of tea and toast. Lena stood by the counter, moving slowly, holding a dish towel. Her hair was pulled into a bun, her face pale but determined. "You look better," Graham said, "still sore, still dizzy sometimes, but better." He handed her a white envelope. She looked at it like it might bite. "What's this? An advance. To cover anything you need. Doctor visits, food, rent. I told you I know. You don't want charity. It's not charity. It's a thank you." She hesitated. "I don't understand. You kept showing up, every day, even when it hurt. You deserve someone to show up for you." She lowered the envelope slowly, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Willow walked over and took Graham's hand. "Do you want to see my picture? I'd love to." She led him to the couch, pulling out a sheet with bright swirls of color. "This is us," she said. "You, me, and Mommy. We're at the park." He stared at the crayon figures. A tall man in a suit, a woman with curly hair, a little girl holding both their hands. He didn't know what to say. Lena stood in the doorway, watching them. Something unreadable passed through her face. Hope, maybe, or fear. "Willow," she said gently, "why don't you show Mr. Mercer the new book we got?" The girl nodded and ran to the shelf. Lena walked over and whispered, "You know she's getting attached. I know. She draws you now. I noticed. And what happens if you leave?" He looked at her, steady and calm. "I won't." She held his gaze a moment longer, then looked away, as if the weight of believing was too much. But he meant it. More than anything, he meant it. The next morning, Graham Mercer walked into his penthouse and felt like a stranger. The floor-to-ceiling windows still shimmered with the same skyline. The marble countertops gleamed. The espresso machine hissed to life with its usual precision. But everything felt off, like someone had reset the dimensions just enough to make it unfamiliar. He placed his keys in the bowl by the door and stood for a moment, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually, he would go straight to his desk, check emails, run through reports, confirm the markets, skim legal summaries. But now, the silence seemed louder, emptier. He walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Everything was organized rows of bottled water, neatly stacked containers, perfect produce. And yet, he felt no hunger, just a dull, echoing tension in his chest. His phone buzzed on the counter, a calendar reminder, lunch meeting with investors, budget strategy, portfolio reallocation. He turned it face down. Instead, he sat at the dining table and let his mind drift to Lena and Willow. He remembered the way Willow had proudly shown him her drawing, how she placed him in the center between her and her mother, like he belonged there. He had no idea how long it had been since someone had drawn him, let alone with warmth. That afternoon, at the office, he was physically present but mentally elsewhere. He nodded in meetings, signed off on plans, listened to Colton's follow-up pitch with all the right expressions. But internally, he was back in that apartment, back in the smell of tea and the scratch of crayons. Julia Kim noticed it first. After a meeting with HR about internal restructuring, she approached him carefully. "Sir," she said quietly, "everything all right?" Graham looked up at her. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, but something in her expression made him pause. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. Julia's brows lifted slightly. She wasn't used to honesty from men like him, but she appreciated it. Later, as the building emptied for the evening, Graham stood in his office, watching the reflection of the city lights in the glass. He thought about how easy it would be to stay on the top floor forever, to look down and never step into the lives that existed below. For years, he had lived that way, watched, measured, controlled, but now he didn't want to watch anymore. He wanted to see. He left the office without his driver, without a call, just him, walking through the lobby into the evening air. He picked up a few groceries on the way. Nothing extravagant. Just a box of cereal, some fruit, orange juice. He remembered Willow saying she liked oranges. He had listened. The apartment building looked the same as before, tired, dim, struggling to hold itself together. He climbed the stairs and knocked lightly. This time, Willow answered faster. She smiled when she saw him. "I knew it was you," she said. Graham smiled back. "How did you know I looked through the peephole?" she said. "Matter of fact." He stepped inside and held up the bag. "Thought you might need a refill on juice." "Mommy likes juice too," Willow said, taking the bag and carrying it with both arms toward the kitchen like it was a treasure chest. Lena was in the living room, sitting on the worn couch with a blanket over her legs. She looked better, more color in her cheeks, but tired, still, like someone fighting a quiet war inside her body. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, her tone soft but uncertain. "I wanted to," Graham replied. "It's just groceries, nothing grand." She offered a small nod and looked toward the kitchen where Willow was already sorting fruit into a bowl. "She organizes everything now," Lena said. "Keeps pretending she's a store manager. She's good at it. She's too grown up." Silence settled between them, not awkward, just real. Lena shifted slightly, wincing. Graham noticed and stepped closer. "You okay?" "Still sore," she said. "Some days better than others." "Have you had the doctor visit yet Monday?" she replied. "Thank you again for helping. I mean it." Graham nodded, then lowered himself into the armchair across from her. He sat differently now, not like a guest, not like a man in charge, but like someone who was learning how to be part of something smaller and truer. "I used to think the world only respected hard edges," he said suddenly. "Precision, discipline, deadlines. I thought softness made people weak." Lena tilted her head. "And now I think softness might be the strongest thing there is." She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed slightly. Willow came over with 2 oranges, one in each hand. "Want one?" "Sure," Graham said, "but only if you share it with me." She nodded and ran back for a butter knife, as she peeled the fruit with careful focus. Graham watched her hands, small, careful, determined. There was something sacred in the way children moved when they tried to help, something that made the rest of the world seem artificial. Lena shifted the blanket around her knees. "You know," she said, "I never expected you to come back. Not after the first visit. I wasn't sure I would either." "So why did you—" Graham glanced at Willow, who was now placing orange segments on a paper napkin like fine china. "Because I didn't want to wonder who I would have been if I didn't." Lena looked down. There was something inside her, a wall, maybe, built by years of disappointment, of being overlooked, of being invisible to people in suits and boardrooms, but the cracks were beginning to show. And in those cracks, something warmer began to move. That night, when Graham left, Willow walked him to the door. She looked up at him, holding the edge of his coat. "Will you come back tomorrow?" He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to say it in a way she could believe. "Yes," he said, "I'll be here." She nodded, satisfied. Then she reached up and hugged him. It was quick, unannounced. Small arms around his middle, a soft press of trust against his chest. He didn't move at first. Then he placed a gentle hand on her back, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel something without needing to label it. When he returned to his penthouse that night, he didn't go to his desk, he didn't check his email, he didn't turn on the news. He walked to his bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the city lights flickering through the glass. And all he could think about was a paper napkin covered in orange slices and a little girl who had finally stopped asking if he would leave. Graham Mercer awoke before dawn, not to the buzz of a scheduled alarm or the light of his home automation system. He simply opened his eyes, fully alert, like something inside had nudged him awake. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the stillness of his own room. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that had once comforted him but now made him restless. He padded into the kitchen, barefoot on the cold floor, and poured a glass of water. He didn't drink it right away. He stared out the window toward the sleeping city and thought of Willow's tiny voice offering him an orange slice, her hands sticky with juice. He thought of Lena's soft-spoken gratitude and the way she had looked away when she said she didn't want her daughter getting attached. He understood that look. He'd seen it before, but not on her, on his mother. Graham walked to his study, opened the old wooden cabinet he rarely used, and pulled out a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos, folded letters, a worn wristwatch that no longer ticked. He hadn't grown up in luxury. People assumed he had, that anyone who ran a billion-dollar company must have come from a long line of success stories. But Graham knew the truth. He was born in a 2-bedroom house in northern Indiana, raised by a woman who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father had left when he was 6. His mother, Eloise, had never spoken a word against him. She just worked harder. She was the first person he had ever loved, and the first person he had ever watched slowly disappear. By the time he turned 17, she could barely stand from exhaustion. She refused to see a doctor, said they couldn't afford it, said she'd be fine, said she just needed to keep going. She collapsed on a Saturday morning. Graham had been in the next room. He found her curled on the floor, her hand reaching toward the telephone. He still remembered the way her breathing sounded. He called 911, tried to stay calm, held her hand. She didn't make it to the hospital. For years, he buried that memory under ambition. He told himself he'd never let money be the reason he lost someone again. He built his career on control, power, order, and now, 2 decades later, he was sitting in a penthouse looking at a picture of a woman who died from the very same silence Lena Hartley had tried to endure. He rubbed his eyes and stood, feeling unsteady. Later that morning, he canceled his meetings again. Julia didn't question it. She had started to sense that something inside her boss was shifting, and for the first time in her career, she didn't mind the unpredictability. Graham drove himself to the south side again. When he arrived at the apartment, Willow was waiting by the window and ran to open the door. "You're early," she said with a grin. "I missed you," he replied before he could think. She beamed and led him inside. Lena was sitting at the table with a notebook and a cup of tea. She looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "You're becoming a regular," she said softly. "I hope that's all right." She nodded and motioned for him to sit. Willow sat beside him, pulling out her crayons. "I'm drawing a spaceship today. You want to help?" Graham smiled. "Only if I can ride in it." Willow handed him a blue crayon. "You can be the captain." As she colored, Lena sipped her tea and watched them. "You're good with her," she said after a moment. "She's easy to care about. Most people don't look twice. Most people are blind," Graham said. Lena tilted her head, studying him. "What changed you?" He paused, then answered honestly. "My mother." He told her, for the first time in years, about Eloise Mercer, about the long he told her, for the first time in years, about Eloise Mercer, about the long shifts at the laundromat, about the way she packed his school lunch even when she hadn't eaten herself, about the stroke that took her away when he was 17, and how helpless he had felt holding her hand, begging her to wake up. Lena listened in silence, her fingers curled around her teacup. "She never asked for help," Graham said, his voice low. "She was proud, tired, too tired to explain how tired. I told myself I'd build a life where no one around me would ever suffer like that again. And you did," Lena said gently. He shook his head. "No, I just built a life where I didn't have to see it." The confession came out more easily than he expected. The truth had been sitting in his chest for years, heavy and unresolved. "I thought if I made enough money, if I was sharp enough, distant enough, no one could hurt me again. That control would protect me from losing someone the way I lost her." Lena set her tea down and leaned forward slightly. "That's not weakness, Graham. That's grief." He looked at her, the corners of his eyes tight. "She was everything. And she died on a cold kitchen floor because no one checked in. No one came to help." Lena reached across the table, slowly, and placed her hand on his. "Someone came this time." She said, "You did." Willow had grown quiet beside them, not understanding the full depth of the conversation, but sensing its weight. She looked up at Graham and leaned gently against his side. He placed a hand on her back, grounding himself in the smallness and warmth of her presence. The apartment was filled with stillness, but it was no longer the heavy kind. It was shared, honest, a space held between people who had stopped pretending they weren't broken in places. After a few minutes, Lena cleared her throat softly. "Would you like to see something?" He nodded. She rose slowly from her chair and walked to the small hallway that led to her bedroom. When she returned, she held a photo album in her hands. The cover was faded, the edges curled with time. She placed it on the table between them and opened it to the first page. "This is my mother," she said, "and that's me. I was about Willow's age in that photo. She worked nights at a bakery, never missed a shift, even when she was sick. I think I get my stubbornness from her." Graham studied the photograph. A woman with tired eyes but a bright smile stood beside a young girl in pigtails, both of them coated lightly in flour. "I used to sleep under the counter while she worked," Lena said, smiling faintly. "She'd tuck a towel under my head like it was a pillow." Willow perked up. "Did she let you eat cupcakes? Only if I didn't fall asleep before sunrise?" Lena teased. They turned a few more pages. Pictures of Lena in high school, holding a diploma, a photo of her and a man Graham hadn't seen before. "My husband," she said quietly, answering the unspoken question. "Willow's father." Graham didn't ask. He waited. He left when Willow was 4. Said he couldn't handle the pressure, being a dad, the bills, the quiet. Said it was too much for someone who still wanted to live. I'm sorry, Graham said. She closed the album gently. You stay long enough in silence, and you start to think it's your fault, that maybe you talk too much or not enough, that maybe people leave because you're hard to stay for. He met her eyes, steady and sure. You're not hard to stay for. Lena. She didn't respond right away. Her mouth tightened like she wanted to believe him but had trained herself not to. People say a lot of things, she whispered, but they don't always mean them. I'm not people, Graham replied. Willow tugged at his sleeve then. Can I ask something? He turned toward her, softening. Of course. She pointed to the photo album. Will I have one of these too? When I grow up, Lena smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's cheek. Of course you will, baby. I want pictures with you, Willow said, looking at both of them. And with him. Graham's heart clenched. He didn't know how to answer that, so he reached for his phone. Let's take one right now. He crouched beside her while Lena leaned over the table. Willow giggled as Graham clicked the photo. It wasn't perfect. The lighting was dim. Lena's hair was pulled back hastily, and Graham's expression was softer than usual, almost vulnerable. But in that photo, something real had been captured. Later that night, after he returned home, Graham looked at the picture again. He saved it as his phone wallpaper. Then he opened his laptop, stared at the blinking cursor on a blank email for several seconds, and finally began to type. To Marianne Ford, subject Hartley, medical leave, fund proposal. He detailed a plan, not just for Lena, for every contract worker who served Mercer buildings, silently and without security. He proposed a new clause emergency leave with pay, health care stipends, on-call family support. It would cost money, but it would save something far more important. At the bottom of the email, he added one final line, because showing up should never come at the cost of survival. He hit send, then he turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and for the first time in many months, slept deeply. Not because he had control, but because he was finally learning how to let it go. Graham Mercer arrived at the office before sunrise. The city was still quiet, lights flickering on in scattered windows across the skyline. He liked these early hours, the stillness before the building came alive with buzzing phones and shoes echoing down the marble floors. But today, the calm didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like the air knew something was about to break. He stood by the window, coffee cooling in his hand, his thoughts still anchored to the photo on his phone, the one with Willow's bright eyes and Lena's soft, tired smile. He glanced at it now, just for a second. It grounded him more than the caffeine. The door opened behind him. Julia Kim stepped in, her heels soft against the carpet. She had a tablet in hand and a crease between her brows. You have a meeting with Colton Reeves in 20 minutes, she said. He asked to speak privately before the board convenes. Graham nodded. Let him in when he arrives. Julia hesitated. There's some talk going around. People are surprised by the changes you've been making. He looked at her. You mean the talk about me treating employees like people? Julia almost smiled. Something like that. She left, and a few minutes later, Colton walked in. He didn't sit, just stood across from Graham, arms crossed, tie slightly loosened. You've been busy. Colton said. Graham said nothing. I saw the proposal you sent to Marianne. emergency funds for custodial and maintenance staff, paid leave, health stipends. That's going to cost real money. It will, Graham agreed. Colton's jaw tightened. It's going to affect Q4 margins. Our shareholders are already uneasy about inflation. They want assurances, not surprises. They'll get returns, Graham said, just not at the cost of someone else's dignity. This isn't about dignity. It's about focus, discipline. We're not a charity. Graham took a step closer, his voice low and calm, and yet the most disciplined people in this building are the ones no one notices. Colton exhaled sharply. What is this really about? Because this doesn't feel like leadership. This feels personal. Graham didn't blink. It is personal. There was a beat of silence between them, dense with unspoken things. Colton's voice softened, but not kindly. You're not the man who built this company anymore, and people are noticing. Graham studied him. Maybe that's the point. Colton left without another word. Later that morning, the boardroom buzzed with quiet tension. The room was full directors, advisors, a few department heads. Reports sat neatly stacked, untouched. All eyes turned to Graham as he entered. He didn't open his folder. He didn't speak from notes. He stood at the head of the table and let the silence settle. I've made some changes, he began, and I know some of you are uncomfortable with them. Murmurs, shifting chairs. I've redirected company resources to support contract staff specifically. Those working in the roles we often overlook, cleaning, security, maintenance, the people who show up before we do and leave long after we're gone. Someone cleared their throat at the far end of the table. Why now? One board member asked. What's changed? Graham's fingers rested on the edge of the table. Perspective? The word hung in the air. I used to believe performance was everything, that efficiency justified every choice, that silence was a sign of discipline. But silence can also be a cry for help. We've built an empire on order, but we forgot who cleans up after us when we leave the room. The room was still. One woman leaned forward. And you expect shareholders to support this shift? I expect them to understand that value is more than dividends, that we're not just managing numbers, we're responsible for lives. This isn't radical, it's overdue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to win them over with charm or force. He just told the truth. After the meeting, some nodded quietly, others looked skeptical. A few, like Colton, walked out without making eye contact. Back in his office, Julia entered with a document for review. She set it on the desk, then lingered. Rough room, she said. Graham looked up. You heard I didn't need to. The walls talk. He smiled faintly. You think I'm making a mistake? Julia shook her head. I think you're remembering who you are. That afternoon, he returned to the Hartleys. He didn't bring groceries this time. He just came with time. Willow opened the door with a wide grin. I drew something, she announced. She led him to the living room, where a crayon drawing sat proudly on the table. 3 stick figures again. Graham, Lena, and Willow, this time in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. I put a fireplace, Willow explained, because fireplaces mean people stay. Graham crouched beside her. Is that what you want? She nodded. I like when you stay. Lena appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. She looked at Graham and hesitated, reading something in his face. Everything okay? He stood slowly. I'm not sure. People at the office are starting to question the changes, the direction." She tilted her head. "And that surprises you?" "No," he said, "but it makes it harder. Doing the right thing usually is." They sat on the couch while Willow colored quietly on the floor. Graham stared at his hands, unusually still. "I spent years being a version of myself that people respected, feared, maybe. A man with control, with distance, and now I feel like I'm breaking that version, and I don't know what's left underneath." Lena looked at him carefully. Maybe someone real. He turned to her. "What if that person isn't enough?" She held his gaze. "He already is." Willow climbed onto the couch beside him, resting her head on his arm. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just let her be there. And in that quiet, he felt something settle, not certainty, but peace. When he left that night, Lena walked him to the door. "People might walk away," she said gently. "When you change, I know, but the right ones stay." He nodded. "I'm hoping they do." As he stepped out into the hallway, Willow called from behind him. "You'll come back tomorrow." He turned. Always. It was a Thursday afternoon when Graham Mercer showed up with 2 puzzles under his arm. One was a space-themed jigsaw for Willow, the other a 1,000-piece painting of a lighthouse battered by waves. He liked the metaphor: steady, strong, weathered. Willow squealed with excitement when she saw the puzzle, hugging the box like it was made of gold. She pulled him into the living room and laid the pieces out on the floor with dramatic ceremony. Lena, watching from the kitchen, smiled at the sight. "You're going to spoil her," she teased. Graham glanced over. "Too late. I think she's already royalty." He knelt to help Willow sort the edges. The 2 of them worked in a rhythm that didn't need words. She pointed. He followed. She narrated. He listened. Half an hour passed like that, peaceful and slow. Then, without looking up, Willow said, "Are you my dad now?" The question dropped like a pebble in still water, small but deep. Graham paused mid-piece, his fingers resting on the cardboard edge. Lena froze in the kitchen doorway, her hand still on the faucet. Willow looked up, not with confusion, but curiosity, a simple, open-hearted question. Graham didn't rush to answer. He sat back on his heels, looked at her, and said gently, "Why do you ask that?" Willow shrugged. "Because you come back, you stay. That's what dads do." "Right." Lena stepped in quickly. "Willow, no," Graham interrupted, raising a calm hand. "It's okay." He turned fully toward Willow. "I'm not your dad," he said softly, "but I care about you. A lot. And I'll always be here if you need me." Willow frowned. "But my real dad left?" Graham nodded. "I know. Do you know where he went?" "No," Graham said, "but wherever he is, it wasn't your fault." Willow picked up a puzzle piece, turning it in her small hand. "Mom said he got scared." Graham glanced at Lena. She looked tired, not embarrassed, just worn from carrying years of answers she didn't want to explain. "Sometimes," Graham said slowly, "people leave not because they don't love, but because they don't know how." Willow blinked. "That doesn't make sense." He smiled gently. "It doesn't have to. It just means it's not your fault." She didn't answer, just nestled closer to him and kept puzzling. Lena walked over and sat beside them. Her eyes were glistening, but she kept her voice even. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Graham replied. "She deserves to ask." Later, when Willow napped in her bedroom, Graham and Lena sat at the kitchen table. The sun had begun its descent, casting golden stripes across the walls. "She's asked before," Lena said quietly, "about him." Graham sipped his tea. "And what do you say I tell her he left because he was confused, because he didn't know how to be what we needed? That's more generous than he deserves." Lena looked at him, serious. "I don't want her to grow up hating him. I just want her to understand that she's enough, even if he wasn't." They sat in silence for a few moments. Graham thought about his own father, a man who had disappeared before birthdays and graduations, a ghost he stopped believing in long ago. "I get it," he said. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of the man who left me." "You think you're succeeding?" Graham gave a faint smile. "I don't know, but I didn't leave when things got complicated." She nodded, eyes soft. Then she asked, "Why are you really still here?" "Graham." He blinked, surprised. "I mean it," she continued. "Is it guilt duty? Some buried sense of justice from your past?" He stared at his tea, thought carefully. It started with guilt, he admitted, then curiosity, then something else. "I think maybe I'm here because this feels more honest than anything I've built." He looked up. "I'm not used to being needed, and I didn't think I wanted to be." Lena's gaze didn't waver, but now he nodded slowly. "Now I think I was lonelier than I realized." The air between them warmed. Not romantic, not forced, just open, present. "You don't have to fix everything," Lena said. "You don't owe us that." "I know," he replied, "but I want to build something, not just companies, not just legacies." She exhaled softly, resting her chin on her hand. "She asked me last week if you were her best friend. She said, I told her I think you might be." Graham smiled. Before he left that evening, Willow had woken up and insisted he help finish the sky and the puzzle. He sat with her for another hour, just placing blue pieces beside blue pieces, quietly, until the corners clicked into place. When he stood to leave, Willow hugged him tightly around the waist. "Even if you're not my dad," she said, "can you still come back?" Graham knelt down to her level. "I'll always come back, Willow." She looked him in the eye, searching for cracks in the promise. She didn't find any. Back in his car, Graham sat for several minutes before starting the engine. His phone buzzed, a text from Colton Emergency Board meeting tomorrow. 10, you'll want to be prepared." Graham stared at the message, jaw tight. Something was coming, but this time he wouldn't face it alone. The elevator ride to the 48th floor felt longer than usual. Graham Mercer stood motionless, shoulders squared, jaw firm. His reflection in the mirrored doors looked older than it had the week before. Not tired, anchored, weathered. There was something unshakable in his eyes, even if a storm waited on the other side of that meeting room. When the doors opened, Julia Kim was waiting outside the boardroom, her tablet clutched tight. "They started without you," she said quietly. "Colton's been presenting financial slides for 20 minutes. They're painting it like a crisis." Graham nodded once. "Let them finish." Julia hesitated. "Do you want me to come in?" "No," he said gently, "but thank you." She gave him a look that said more than words could. Then she stepped aside and let him walk in alone. The boardroom was full, every seat occupied. Charts glowed across the main screen graphs, red arrows, projections. Colton stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled, pointer in hand like a man leading a prosecution. The conversation died the moment Graham entered. Colton turned with a practiced smile. "Graham, glad you could join us." Graham walked to his seat, unhurried. He didn't sit. He placed both hands on the back of his chair and looked around the room. "Before you continue," he said calmly, "I'd like to hear exactly what's being questioned here." A woman near the center cleared her throat. "We're concerned about the recent initiatives you've greenlit without full board approval. These healthcare subsidies, emergency leave programs, they're admirable but costly and abrupt." Another man added, "And we're seeing pushback from institutional investors. They're asking for transparency. They're asking for assurances." Colton stepped forward again. "This company was built on precision and predictability. You're turning it into a social experiment." Graham looked at him. "No, I'm turning it into a company that respects the people holding it up." Colton raised an eyebrow. "And how do you define respect bleeding profits for sentiment?" Graham stepped away from the chair and slowly circled the table. "You all know the quarterly numbers. You know we're profitable. You know our projections remain strong even with these new measures in place. That's not the point." Colton snapped. "The point is that you're making emotional decisions in a seat that requires strategy." Graham stopped walking. He turned fully to Colton, his voice steady. "What makes you think empathy and strategy can't coexist?" The room was silent. No one questions bonuses that go unquestioned. No one balks when we pour millions into marketing initiatives to appear modern and responsible. But when we actually behave that way, when we take real action, it's suddenly a problem. An older man leaned forward. "You're saying this is just business as usual. I'm saying this is overdue," Graham said. "And I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking you to remember why we're here. A company is not its stock price. It's not its logo. It's people. And when we forget that, we lose everything that makes us worth anything." Colton scoffed. "Are you hearing yourself? This isn't a sermon. This is a business." Graham turned to face him. "It was a business when you suggested firing contract cleaners to cut 10% off facilities' costs. It was a business when you approved executive perks that could pay for health coverage for 20 janitors. So yes, Colton, I am hearing myself, and I like what I'm saying." A woman down the table spoke next. She was usually quiet. Finance, mid-60s, glasses always perched at the end of her nose. "My granddaughter works in a call center," she said quietly. "Her company doesn't even give her sick leave. Last week she fainted on the job and they asked her to clock out before calling 911. The room went still. She's 23, smart, working 2 jobs. She cried when she found out your plan included part-timers." Graham looked at her with real gratitude. "Thank you." Another man, younger, looked at his notes, then up. "I think we're asking the wrong question. Not, can we afford this, but what happens if we don't?" Colton tried to regain control. "This kind of shift sets a precedent. What if every company did this? What if people expect it?" "They should," Graham said. That landed deep. He stood at the front now, both hands open. "I'm not trying to make us martyrs. I'm trying to make us human, profitable, yes, but principled. We've outsourced kindness for too long. It's time we bring it back in-house." The silence that followed was different this time, not resistance reflection. He let it breathe, then said quietly, "You can vote however you need to, but I will not walk back what I've implemented. If that means I step down, so be it." There was a rustle of papers, a few shocked looks. Colton's mouth tightened. "Are you threatening resignation? I'm offering alignment," Graham said. "You decide if you still want me here. But I'm not returning to the version of leadership that ignores the people who clean up our mess." He finally sat down. The room remained hushed as the board members looked at one another, the weight of the moment heavy on their shoulders. No one spoke for several minutes. Then the woman with the glasses said, "I vote in favor of retaining Graham Mercer as CEO, and I support the initiatives." One by one, others followed. Colton abstained, but he'd already lost. After the meeting, Graham returned to his office. Julia followed him in, closing the door behind her. "I heard," she said. He looked up. "All of it." She nodded. "You were honest?" "I had to be." She handed him a piece of paper. It was a printout of an internal message from the head of facilities. At the bottom, a note in bold font. One of our cleaning staff broke down crying. Said it's the first time in 15 years anyone cared. Graham set the paper down slowly, then leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile. He breathed. That evening, he didn't go home right away. He drove instead, south again, toward the apartment with the orange door and the girl with the crayon drawings. He wasn't sure what he was becoming, but he knew exactly where he needed to be. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old paint, the kind of scent Graham Mercer was beginning to associate with warmth rather than wear. As he climbed the familiar stairs to the third floor, he heard the muffled sound of Willow singing through the door. She was off-key, joyful, and unfiltered in the way only children could be. He knocked twice. The music stopped. Willow cracked the door open with wide eyes and an even wider grin. "It's you!" She flung the door open and grabbed his hand, pulling him inside with the authority of someone who had already made up her mind about him. "I drew a picture of you in a rocket ship," she said proudly. "You've promoted me again," he replied, feigning surprise. "Captain last week. Now I'm a space explorer." Willow giggled. "You're the pilot. Mom says you probably own the moon." Lena appeared in the kitchen, laughing quietly. I said no such thing. She had her hair tied up in a loose scarf, sleeves rolled, and Graham could tell she had been cleaning. Not for guests, for herself. "You're just in time," she said. "I made lentil soup." "Oh, I didn't know I was hungry until you said that," Graham said, following the smell to the table. As they sat down, the atmosphere felt easy, familiar. Willow talked about her day at school, how she read aloud in class, and how another student had copied her drawing and claimed it was their own. Graham listened carefully, asking questions, encouraging her. Lena just watched, something soft in her expression that she didn't try to hide anymore. But halfway through the meal, there was a knock at the door. Lena stiffened. Willow looked up. "Are you expecting someone?" "No," Lena said, already rising. "Stay here." She walked to the door and opened it just enough to peek out. Graham couldn't hear the words, but he caught the tone. Low, tight, confrontational. When Lena didn't open the door wider, the man outside raised his voice. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to see her." Graham stood instinctively. Lena's hand on the doorframe was trembling. "I told you we're fine," she said flatly. "You don't get to show up whenever it suits you." Willow had gone completely still. "Is that my dad?" she whispered to Graham. He didn't answer, just reached out and gently pulled her close. Lena stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her. The conversation outside grew louder, too loud to ignore. "You think you're better than me now, letting rich men play house with my daughter." Lena's voice was sharp. "Leave, before I call someone." Like him, the man sneered. "He your new protector now." Graham felt his blood rise, but he didn't move toward the door. He looked at Willow. Her face was pale, her lip trembling. He sat on the floor beside her, lowered his voice. "Hey," he said gently, "you're safe. You hear me?" She nodded, but didn't speak. Outside, the argument continued. A door down the hall creaked open and then shut again. Someone was listening. Eventually, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Lena returned a moment later, her hand shaking as she locked the door. She leaned back against it, eyes closed. Willow ran to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. "It was him," she whispered. "Wasn't it Lena didn't lie? Yes, baby, but he's gone now." Graham stood but kept his distance. Lena opened her eyes and looked at him, something heavy in her expression. "I'm sorry you had to see that. You don't have to explain," he said softly. She looked down at Willow. "Can you go to your room for a minute, sweetheart?" Willow hesitated, then nodded and walked away slowly. The moment she was out of sight, Lena exhaled. "I thought he was gone for good," she said. "I haven't seen him in over 3 years. No calls, no support, nothing." Graham kept his voice calm. "Why now?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe he saw the photos online. Someone at her school might have said something about you visiting. I've tried so hard to keep our world small, quiet, safe." "You did everything right," Graham said. "Don't question that." Lena's hands were clenched. He was cruel, not just careless. "I stayed too long because I was scared. Then I left because Willow started copying how he raised his voice, and I couldn't let her think that was normal." She sat down at the table, head in her hands. "I worked 3 jobs to keep our names off his radar. I never asked for anything, and I was finally breathing again. Until tonight." Graham sat across from her, letting the silence stretch. "I can have someone look into it," he said gently. "Legally, discreetly, if you want." She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Why are you doing this?" "Graham." "Really?" He took a breath. "Because I care. Not out of pity, not out of guilt. Because when I walk into this home, I feel more like myself than I do in my own apartment. Because when Willow calls me her pilot, I believe her. And because you remind me that being seen doesn't always mean being used." Tears welled in Lena's eyes but didn't fall. "That scares me," she whispered. "Me too," he admitted. A long pause followed. Then a soft voice called from the hallway. "Can I come out now?" Lena smiled through the weight in her chest. "Yes, baby." Willow walked into the room with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She went straight to Graham and climbed into his lap. "Are you mad at my dad?" she asked quietly. Graham looked at her, his voice even. "I'm not mad. I just don't like when people make the people I care about feel small." Willow nodded solemnly. "Me neither." They stayed like that for a long time. Lena sat beside them, not speaking, just present. Outside, the hallway lights flickered. But inside, a different kind of light was growing, one made of trust, and it refused to flicker. Graham Mercer didn't sleep that night. After leaving Lena and Willow's apartment, he drove without a destination, city lights passing in blurs as the weight of the evening settled deep into his chest. He could still hear Willow's voice asking if he was angry. He could still see the flicker of fear behind Lena's eyes when her past came knocking. This wasn't a business deal. There were no performance metrics or projections to lean on. This was human, raw, and personal. At sunrise, he parked in front of his office. The city hadn't quite woken yet, but he had fully. By 9 o'clock, he had already placed 4 private calls, 1 to legal, 1 to a trusted investigator, 1 to the head of security, and 1 to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Caroline Nash, a retired family law attorney turned child advocacy consultant, sharp as ever and unwilling to let red tape stop justice. She arrived in his office just after noon, wearing jeans and a navy blazer, her short silver hair swept back like a general arriving for battle. "You always call me when things are complicated," she said, not unkindly. "This one's not a case." Graham replied, "It's a family." He laid everything on the table: Lena, Willow, the unannounced visit, the man from the past, full of venom and threats. Caroline listened, nodding slowly. "What does Lena want to do?" "She's scared," Graham admitted, "but I think she's ready to protect what matters. I just want her to have the tools to do it." Caroline raised an eyebrow, and your role, Graham, leaned back, unblinking. "I don't know what label it falls under, but I'm not walking away." Caroline smiled slightly. "Good answer." Later that evening, Graham returned to the apartment with a folder under his arm and a gentler look in his eyes than the night before. Lena opened the door, and though her expression was guarded, she didn't seem surprised to see him. Willow was in her room, music playing faintly behind the door. Lena gestured for Graham to come in, but he didn't sit. "I brought someone," he said. Caroline stepped into view, extending her hand. "Caroline Nash. I help people when life gets messy." Lena looked at Graham, uncertain. "She's on your side," he assured her. "Not his. Never his." Lena nodded and invited them to the table. For the next hour, Caroline explained legal protections, documentation options, emergency custody filings, and how Lena could formalize her full custody of Willow without room for interference. Lena listened closely. She didn't ask many questions, but Graham could see her mind racing. At the end of it, Caroline handed her the folder. "Everything you need is in there. If you want to proceed, I'll walk you through every step. No fees. Graham already covered that." Lena didn't look at him right away. When she finally did, her eyes were glassy but strong. "I don't know if I can fight him," she whispered. "You already are," Graham said softly. "But what if he tries to twist things? What if the court believes him?" "They won't," Caroline replied firmly. "Not with your history, not with your records, and not with what I've seen tonight." Lena closed the folder and held it to her chest. "I've spent years teaching Willow that love doesn't have to hurt," she said. "Maybe it's time I start believing it, too." Caroline stood to leave, offering one last smile. "Call me any time." "I mean that." Once she was gone, the apartment felt smaller, quieter. Lena stood, walking toward the window. The city glowed beyond the glass, vibrant and distant. "You're doing so much," she said without turning. "More than anyone's ever done. I'm not doing it out of pity, I know. I'm doing it because this feels right." She turned to face him. "That scares me more than the danger." Graham stepped closer. "Why?" "Because if this falls apart, it won't just hurt. It'll shatter us." He didn't deny the risk. He simply took her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't speak, but she didn't pull away. A few minutes later, Willow emerged from her room rubbing her eyes. "Is everything okay now?" she asked. Graham smiled. "We're working on it." Willow walked over and leaned her head against Lena's hip. "Do I still get to draw tomorrow?" Lena laughed gently. "Of course. Baby," Graham kneeled. "Maybe I can bring some new markers." Her face lit up. "Only if they're glitter ones. Deal." That night, Lena didn't ask him to leave. She let him stay while Willow fell asleep, reading a picture book aloud on an old couch. She watched him from the kitchen, watching the way Willow curled next to him, totally at ease. This wasn't a man pretending to care. This was someone trying to stay, and for the first time in years, she let herself imagine what that might mean. When Graham finally stood to go, Lena walked him to the door. She didn't speak at first, but as he turned the handle, she said quietly, "You're changing me." He looked back. "You're changing me too." Then he was gone, but the warmth lingered, and so did hope. It rained the next morning, not the kind of soft drizzle that whispered against windows, but a steady, gray downpour that turned sidewalks into mirrors and muffled the city's usual noise. Graham Mercer stood in front of the courthouse under a black umbrella, watching the building as if it held the final piece of something he'd been carrying for years. Lena arrived with Willow, both in matching raincoats. The child's had yellow stars printed on it, bright against the gloom. She waved when she saw him, and Graham bent slightly so she could leap into his arms. "You didn't forget," she said, burying her head against his shoulder. "Not a chance." Lena walked up beside him, her eyes tired but determined. "You ready?" she asked. "Only if you are," Graham said. Inside, Caroline Nash was already waiting, her briefcase dry, her glasses fogging slightly. She smiled when she saw them. "Custody reaffirmation should be simple," she said softly, "given the documents, history, and the judge assigned. But if he shows up, he won't," Lena said, cutting her off gently. He had his chance. The proceedings were quiet, almost anticlimactic. The courtroom was empty aside from them and a few clerks. The judge reviewed the case, listened to Caroline's clear and confident explanation, then asked Lena to speak. She stood and held Willow's hand as she walked to the front. "I left him because I knew what kind of woman I didn't want to be, and more importantly, what kind of girl I didn't want my daughter to become." She said, "We've been on our own, and we've been okay, but we shouldn't have to be scared. And I want it in writing now, legally, that he cannot walk back in just because it's convenient for him." Her voice didn't shake. The judge nodded, impressed with her composure. 15 minutes later, it was official. Sole legal custody, emergency contact restrictions, a file sealed with the weight of justice behind it. When they walked out into the rain again, Lena let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Willow tugged at Graham's coat. "Does this mean we're safe now?" Graham looked down at her, crouched to her eye level. "Yes," he said. "It means your mom made sure of it." Lena smiled, holding back tears. Not from fear this time, but release. Later that night, they celebrated at Graham's apartment. It wasn't grand by his standards. It was sleek, minimalist, full of sharp corners and silent walls. But with Willow's crayon drawings now taped to the fridge and Lena's scarf draped over the back of the couch, it felt warmer than it ever had. They ordered pizza. Willow insisted on pineapple. Graham pretended to hate it, and she laughed every time he made a dramatic face biting into a slice. Lena watched the two of them from the kitchen, arms folded, heart full. "I never expected this," she said later, as Willow fell asleep in the guest room Graham had rushed to furnish just 2 days earlier. "Neither did I," Graham replied. They sat on the balcony, the storm having cleared, city lights blinking like distant candles. "I spent so long building walls," Graham said, "not just around my career, around myself, around everything. I did too," Lena admitted, "except mine were out of fear, not pride. Mine were both," he said, "honest." There was a long pause. "I keep thinking about how this started," she added. "You were going to fire me." Graham winced. "Not one of my better days." She smiled, "But maybe one of the most important." He looked at her. "Do you regret it meeting you?" she asked. He nodded. "No," she whispered, "not even little." He reached across and took her hand. "I want to build something real with you," he said. "Not a fantasy, not a fairy tale. Just real." She squeezed his fingers. "Me too." The weeks that followed were a quiet transformation. Lena continued working part-time with the facilities department, but she was no longer invisible. Graham made sure of that. She sat in on discussions about worker rights. Her insight helped shape new parental leave programs. She even stood beside Julia at an employee town hall, answering questions about dignity in the workplace. Julia, who had once kept strict boundaries, now found herself genuinely smiling when she saw Lena in the building. "This place needed a woman like you," she told her once. "Not just for Graham, for all of us." Willow thrived. Her drawings got brighter, her sleep deeper. She started telling everyone her favorite color was CEO silver, which no one understood except Graham. And Graham. He changed, too. He no longer worked until midnight. He no longer spoke with clipped syllables and blank expressions. He laughed more, listened more. He stopped calling it the company. He started calling it our people. One night, Graham took Lena and Willow out to the night market, the same kind of place he had once wandered alone in a tailored suit, disconnected from everything real. Willow raced ahead between glowing stalls. Lena held his arm. "This is what peace looks like," she said. He looked around and realized she was right. He had built towers, profits, legacies, but he had never built peace. Until now. That night. Willow curled up in her bed at Graham's place, a glitter marker still clutched in her hand. Lena watched her sleep for a long time before joining Graham in the living room. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For seeing us?" He pulled her close. "No," he said. "Thank you for letting me..." Outside, the city shimmered with light. Inside, a man who once believed nothing could change him now sat beside the very reason he had changed. Love, he realized, wasn't just something that found you. It was something you stayed for, and he was staying. Home, at last. In a world where power so often silences compassion, one CEO chose to listen, and it changed everything. Graham Mercer began as a man ruled by order, numbers, and detachment, but through a single act of empathy and the honesty of a little girl named Willow, he rediscovered what truly matters. Not profit margins or public image, but people, lives, love, dignity. Lena Hartley wasn't just a cleaner, she was a mother, a survivor, a woman who fought every day to protect her daughter's light in a dark world. Her story reminds us that behind every uniform is a human being worthy of respect, worthy of protection, and worthy of being seen. The story isn't just fiction, it's a mirror a reminder that injustice often hides in everyday moments, that real strength is quiet, and that change begins the moment we decide to care. If this story touched you, let it remind you that kindness can be revolutionary. Let's stand against systems that diminish the vulnerable, and let's celebrate the courage of those who speak up, even when they whisper. If this story moved your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We have more powerful stories coming soon. Thank you for watching.